So to start us off, first of all, we need to acknowledge high crop prices right now. It means there's potentially great rewards for high yields, but we have to acknowledge there's high penalties if we under-fertilize and don't achieve some of that yield potential that's there. So we're looking at crop prices on one hand. The next, we're looking at high fertilizer prices. And with that, with the high cost of fertilizer, we get penalized on the other end for over-fertilizing. So it's really important to watch that economics. But here's something else that rarely do we seem to deal with much in Manitoba. We just have had some very good weather the last couple of decades, but boy, did we get spanked last year with drought. And so we need to acknowledge that and see that it's not completely gone away. This is from the federal government looking at the Drought Monitor, and they still have Manitoba colored in red and brown here. So glad to see the snow, but we need more, and we need it to go in the ground. We need some good soil recharge so that we can exploit it with some high yields and good profitability. So Don likens this to other presentations we've done in the past, and it's like gambling. Only now we've had to move to the high stakes table because to maximize return, we've got to be extra careful. And it's not just fertility, it's crop selection, your other general agronomy in conjunction with nutrient management. And unless you've been living under a rock, you know that this is our dogma, or our crusade is the 4R nutrient stewardship approach. And I believe, Pam, your association is also signed on as this being the way, the path forward into good sustainable crop production, this 4R approach of the right source, rate, time, and place. So I'm going to tackle the nitrogen aspect, and Dawn will follow up with PK and the rest of the nutrients, including some manure comments. So first, before we get to fertility, we're going to talk about crop selection, because maybe your soil tests are going to drive your crop selection. This is just looking at, and we're going to rely on a lot of AgVi's soil labs guidelines, because they do a really good job of reporting back survey results from what they're finding. And what they were finding early in the season was that there was a ton of nitrogen banked in the soil, not used by the crop. And just in context here, typical would be in that range, 21 to 40 pounds of residual nitrogen. The bulk of the nitrogen is much more than that. And if we, I should try to get this pointer working. So the typical range would be in this amount of residual carryover nitrogen, yet we have the bulk is a lot more than that. This column here being the median means that in those areas, half the samples tested more, half tested less. So you can see that in a lot of those sites, there is a whack of nitrogen that was unused by the previous crop, potentially waiting for 2022. Now, why you might use that leftover nitrogen to guide your crop selection, this is just looking at the potential economic benefits of that, and look at the cost of production on the right side of the screen there, and see that, you know, holy jumping, you guys in Carmen area, I could buy land for this if I had been smart enough 25 years ago. Now it's, you know, $600 to $800 to put some of these crops as a cost of production. So there's some high stakes at place here, and fertilizer costs are a good portion of that. So if simply by allocating some of those crops where nitrogen requirement is low, like legumes or soybeans or others, target those on your low nitrogen soils where you're measuring high residual, and then your non-legumes, high input crops like canola, wheat, and corn. And the other things that we typically do, we try to avoid soybeans on high nitrogen soils, just that they won't make use of it. But there's also other baggage that comes with that, like iron deficiency. And your grandfather told you, don't grow flax after canola because of the phosphorus drag, lack of mycorrhizae. So those kind of rules behind us. Let's focus now on nutrient management. Again, rate, source, timing, and placement. Only we're going to look at a special formulation, an EC brand called extra careful formulation because of the high stakes economics. And I'm going to look at the rate. And if we're looking at playing the rate game, of course, the first card we want to play is the soil test. And then we have others that we need to consider as we're looking at what would be a suitable rate. And then there's even a joker in this deck of cards that we'll talk about. So first of all, that soil test amounts. Even a refugee from Ontario like me, I can go back and see when the past droughts were. I just look at when was the high nitrate levels occurring. And those tend to coincide very well with drought years. Drought year, low yield potential, unused nitrogen, and so soil test summaries tend to point those out. As far as 2021, we can look up on the map in Manitoba, and of course, the Interlake area has the prestige, reputation of having the most soil banked nitrogen, but that's really just a testament to the lack of rainfall in that area. Much of Manitoba, certainly eastern Manitoba, where the drought was, have high levels. And I guess I should just interject here, that not everyone has high nitrogen levels. There were areas that had some good moisture, had timely rains, had some bang up crops. And where the crops were good, the nitrate levels were depleted. I don't particularly feel sorry for those folks because they made out like thieves with good yields. But again, they'll be spending that money on fertility this next year. And about just back again to here, looking that there are some fields that will require very little nitrogen fertilizer this next year. Now, I don't know if Roger's on the line, but Roger called me yesterday to say, I better say something about how reliable that high nitrogen is. And on the prairies here, the fall nitrogen test generally is a pretty reliable estimate for us because it follows, 6 months of frozen soil. But there are exceptions to that when we're unusually wet, particularly spring flooding in depressional areas. And we can lose that nitrate nitrogen, just like we can lose nitrogen from fertilizer. If we get excess water on sandy areas, we can move that nitrate below the root zone. But more problematic in Manitoba is if we get flooding or standing water on heavier soils, we get denitrification. When the microbes, they essentially suffocate for lack of oxygen. Rather than die, though, they just use up our nitrate to the tune of 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. So yes, we can see depletion of nitrogen levels in the soil. Let's look at the fertility credits here. First, there's manure, and Don will mention more about this. It's often priced per pound of nitrogen or at the cost of application. If you're following terminated forage legumes, you start with 90 pounds of nitrogen and you subtract that as you move away from a full legume stand to grass. Or if you delay your termination till fall, it's about half of what a midsummer termination would be. Pulse crops, you get nothing for soybeans. We've shown this in at least 3 research studies in Manitoba. So really, soybeans, if you soil test, they leave the soil with the least amount of nitrogen of any of the crops we follow. Peas often will contribute some. In the past, we told you not to tap into that because we said the yield bonus and the protein bonus more than made up for that. But if you're tight, you've got 25 pounds following peas you could consider using. Green manure crops, that would be for organic farmers. And again, that's part of their nitrogen strategy. And they've got a bit of a thumb rule there they can use. Cover crops, I called it the joker in the deck because we know, and I'll show some data this fall, we know that they reduce soil nitrogen by taking it up in the fall, but they don't always give it back. Studies have shown this, and sometimes we can see yield drag following year. Managing those cover crops, I don't think we figured it out yet, but I'd be very reluctant to apportion much credits with nitrogen that they've taken up. And the soil organic matter credit, not in Manitoba. We know that mineralization is very dependent on knowledge of in-season moisture. And we didn't do a very good job of predicting that last year. Last year, we anticipated very little from mineralization. And the other thing that people who give mineralization credits often forget is that it's about equaled by the immobilization. Our fertilizer is immobilized either to decompose straw or simply taken up by the soil microbes. We don't try to figure out this biological gain, we just offer no credit. And besides, all the studies that were done determining fertilization rates, they never used credits. They always were based on the nitrate level. Let's look at some of this regrowth. And this is just in the Carmen area, and you've got a field of oats there, looking better than the original oat crop that was there. But that oat crop regrowth this fall already had 80 pounds of nitrogen taken up in it, out of the soil. And here's a field of canola with Dane lost in it. And that crop was not harvested, but came back to life after some rain. And we measured over 160 pounds of nitrogen in the biomass that was there. The rebar is set in that stuff. We're not going to get all of that coming back. A fraction of that will be available next year. That amount of nitrogen came from the soil reserves. Biologicals, Pam, you asked about this. I'm not going to tell you much other than I diddled with it this past year. Some of the farmers on the line hosted a couple of these studies. The easy answer is the first one. I'm not a very good researcher because I couldn't find that it worked anywhere that I tested these biologicals. Work done in Minnesota says that I just need to work a lot harder. They found the biological they worked with worked 1 in 6 times. So Pam, if you roll a dice, every 6th time a 6 will come up. That's your frequency of winning at this game. And but to do that, they needed 6 replicates per plot and a full nitrogen rate ramp in order to show that their biological provided 25 pounds of nitrogen, but really only when the farmer reduced their fertilizer rate. We've got a lot to learn here yet. I really wish that it was ready for prime time. I'm still waiting, and we could talk about that later. I don't want to talk about it anymore right now. Let's talk about some nitrogen rates and response curves. Here we're going to look at 3 of the crops that have some of our highest nitrogen demands. That would be corn, actually fall rye or winter wheat, and canola. And when we look at our guidelines based on these schematic curves, they're demanding anywhere between 150 to 200 pounds total nitrogen, soil plus fertilizer. We'll look at some detailed economics later. Just showing these are the high responding crops. The more moderate responding would be barley and wheat. And looking at those red response curves, they're looking between 110 to 150 pounds total nitrogen, soil and fertilizer. And then we have oats. So very good research, but very dated, and shows that 100 pounds of nitrogen was dead on with optimum yield. Nice to update that though. So, but we've noted that nitrogen needs differ substantially based on moisture. Under dry conditions, even though we have reduced yield potential, more nitrogen is sometimes needed. And it's because nitrogen efficiency is not good under dry conditions. We have less mineralization of organic matter or breakdown of residues. And another one is there's simply not the mass flow of nitrate to the roots. And so the roots have to do all the work. They're not drying. They don't have as much water moving to the roots, carrying nitrogen with them. And so we need to consider some extra response curves that we actually are lucky enough to have for some of our crops. And in fact, these curves we use in our calculator. These are the ones well, the example here is for wheat. There's a lot of studies there that we had access to, and shows that what the response curve would be under moist conditions, 25 experiments. The red line is 67 experiments under what was considered dry, and then 55 experiments under what was arid. That was the Red River Valley in 2021. So if we look at that and we say, well, why is nitrogen, or show me nitrogen's more efficient under moist conditions? If you look at a 40 bushel yield, we could see that I achieved that with, maybe 40 pounds of nitrogen under moist conditions, where I need substantially more than that under dry conditions. And of course, that yield lid is hampered because of just simply the lack of moisture. The arid one there is there, and it's rare that people choose that yield curve, but sometimes it happens to them. And so let's look at how this manifests itself in the calculator. Oh, first, Don put this in here saying, John, make sure you put a disclaimer in there about these yield curves, that there's a number of statistical ways to explain yield response. This is a study that was done that showed, there's several curves that could be fitted nicely to the data with big differences as far as economics. The curve that doesn't always fit Western data, but we're using it here because it allows us to do analysis. If I can get my damn pointer over there. Yeah. Oh, okay, there's a pointer there. Okay, you just have to look at the curve on the upper right-hand corner. That's the quadratic. That's what they use in North Dakota, Ontario, and most of the Corn Belt to explain yield response. And that's the one that we use in our calculators. So our calculator, if you've used it, you may be somewhat familiar with it, but what it does, you input your soil test, your fertilizer, your crop prices, and it will optimize or tell you what rate gives you the optimum return under those conditions. And in the Excel chart here, those blue cells and the orange cells on the sides of them, that's the range within that you will maximize your return or your returns within $1 per acre. So you've actually got like a 30-pound of nitrogen window to hit and still be very profitable. The way that I would suggest a grower may choose to use some of this data or examples is to look at how, if we're doing this in person, Pam, I could use a pointer and I could use it well, but for some reason my mouse has gone missing. So you're just gonna have to look at you use this, put your own data in there, and you can look at how nitrogen rate would change based on your fertilizer price on the top there. And so a farmer can gauge what the impact is and whether it makes sense to consider backing off rates or increasing rates. And so in this, Don has actually taken some examples here and we've summarized them in some tables. And the bar at the top there is for wheat. And if it says, what if you look back at 2021 with moderate fertilizer, moderate crop prices, the optimum nitrogen rate was 115 pounds on top of your soil, yield of 64 bushels an acre. If we go to this year, anticipate high fertilizer and high crop prices, the optimum N rate is slightly less, and that shows that the yields dropped, but only 1 bushel per acre. The profitability is still very good. If we have high fertilizer prices, but only moderate crop prices, then that rate drops another 10 pounds. But again, we're still operating on a fairly flat part of the yield curve down to 62 bushels. So our rates are still keeping us fairly good on the yield curve. If, however, we drop into an arid moisture environment, that's when the wheels fall off. There, only 25 pounds of nitrogen is required because all we're producing is 31 bushels. So that's where early season projections or using farmer knowledge to estimate yield potential is really important. With the canola below, going through those same scenarios with canola, showing that really the nitrogen rates don't change very much based on what last year and this year based on moderate fertilizer crop prices versus high fertilizer and high crop prices. If, however, we don't get the high crop price, this would suggest backing off nitrogen some. Just an illustration, this is how these types of tools can work, and you can use them to estimate doing some fine tuning. Now, I don't have the corn data in there, but this is Don and this is about 6 years of good corn yields where drought or field husbandry wasn't limiting yields. And in those cases, I was able to do the economics. And you could see that with the high moderate corn price and moderate nitrogen price, maybe we're talking 170 to 185 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Well, that's similar, maybe a little more than what we would be looking at if we were looking at high crop prices and high fertilizer prices. The two do travel in tandem. You got to get the other agronomy right too. Take into account your crop rotations, your seeding dates. If you're seeding in June, you can back off your nitrogen rates because you're not going to see benefits. Variety selection is important, particularly like wheat varieties. Weed control, spray early and spray often. You can't afford to feed weeds. They have a big impact on nitrogen efficiency. And something else I want to note here about variable rate applications, up to 1/3 of the soil samples going to AgVise in Manitoba are from zones or grids. So people are looking at this. When residual nitrogen levels are high, there tends to be more variability and more of an opportunity to take advantage of this. So if you're set up with the equipment and the testing, I'd certainly advise to exploit these if you can find and map this variability within your fields. The other thing to finish here is going to be on the efficiency, and I'm going to look at the other things, the sources of nitrogen, timing, and band or placement. And really, I just want to look at, has anything really changed from, if you remember the tune that Dr. Cindy Grant sang for years about how nothing really beats banded nitrogen at or close to seeding. And so do we have anything new on that? Well, yes, we do. At Indian Head, Chris Holzaffel, God love him, does these types of studies. And I have taken the liberty of summarizing several of his studies here. This study is looking at canola, and he's comparing a whack of timing and placement and sources. But to look at on this side, again, what they consider the gold standard, side-banded urea, this is with canola. When we look at broadcasting in the fall, taint very good, the yield index is low. And in fact, broadcasting in the spring doesn't look very promising either. Compared to that, despite some of the added efficiency products, fall banded actually looks pretty good and performs very well. If it's done in the fall, some of these additives may have a place there. I want to go back. We're a little disappointed. His split applications, not very reliable in these studies. We've in Manitoba actually had some very good success with split applications, but they're always contingent on getting some rainfall within about 5 days after that. If you don't get it, your nitrogen's stranded and efficiency suffers. Chris has also done this work 4 site years more with new data that I don't have yet on wheat. Again, side banded is kind of the gold star. Fall broadcast not looking very good, about 90% yield potential. Fall banded performing similarly. One study with fall banded ESN actually did better. But if you look at the spring broadcast, just not performing very well. And again, the split application's not doing as well as we've seen in the more humid Manitoba when we get rainfall. The protein data tends to back that up. So nevertheless, long story short, the consistent winter is still banding nitrogen at seeding, and fall looked very good also. The consistent loser is broadcast. It's underperforming in yield and protein. Gosh, guys, I know you love to go fast. I know you love to, reduce your manpower. And I've given this logistical excuse all the time for broadcasting. It just doesn't put bushels in the bin at the same nitrogen rate. And if we look at the occasional winners, sometimes enhanced efficiency fertilizers aided some of that performance that we saw with the broadcasting. So here's where I'm going to pass off to Dawn. Dawn, are you up to bat?
I'm ready to go.
Take her away.
Okay. Well, it's great to participate in your meeting today. I see a lot of former students and colleagues from the ag industry there, and it's nice to see everybody. I'm going to just take a minute here to get set up for sharing the screen, I hope. And if everything goes well, we should be in business here. Okay, John's covered nitrogen, and I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about PKS and micronutrients, not in as much depth as John's coverage on nitrogen. But to start things off, we'll talk a little bit about phosphorus. We don't really have a very good phosphorus response curve in terms of yield response. It's highly variable from year to year. This is 30 years of data from the same site. And it just shows you the variation in P response, even in the same site, wide variability from year to year. We just don't have a really handy yield response curve to work with when evaluating, whether or not we're going to get our money's worth out of investing in phosphorus fertilizer. So what we have instead is a sort of a probabilistic approach. What are your chances of getting a significant yield increase depending on your soil test P levels? And what we see is anything above about 15 parts per million soil test P using the Olsen method, we start to see a drop off in the percent of responses falling below 50%. So less than half of the sites responding if they have 15 ppm Olsen soil test P or more. This has been a long-standing sort of rule of thumb in Manitoba. You can see these data go all the way back to the 1960s, early 1960s. But if we take a look at later data from the early 1990s, we actually see similar probabilities of responses to phosphate fertilizer. You have about a 50% chance of a P response if you have about 15 part per million Olsen P, and a greater chance of a response if you're less than that, and a smaller chance if you're above that. So that's sort of the probabilistic approach. And what you'd think if you were, short on phosphate fertilizer, physically or economically, that you'd want to therefore invest your phosphate fertilizer in the fields with the lowest soil test P level and the highest probability of a response. But there's another factor to consider. If we take a look at the long-term sort of average yield response, and here's a study from Saskatchewan over 6 years, the average response to additional seed place P varied with the background level of P fertility, where they had good background levels of P fertility because they started this experiment with a bunch of broadcast phosphate. Then that 20 pounds of phosphate that they applied increased yield by maybe only a bushel per acre. Whereas if they hadn't put on that background phosphate and improved their pea fertility, they ended up here with like about a 6 bushel increase in yield from their phosphate fertilizer. So not only do you get a higher probability of a response by focusing your phosphate fertilizer on your low P fields, you also have a larger yield response as well. So low P fields would be your priority. Now, when selecting a rate for phosphate, we do distinguish between the short-term sufficiency approach or the long-term sustainability sort of strategy. Short-term sufficiency, all that you're trying to do is get the good bang for your buck in the year of application. The economic yield response is usually best if you have just a seed-placed rate that's quite low, big benefit, low risk. But that rate is usually less than crop removal. And so what you end up with is a declining pea fertility over time if you practice this. Now, this is okay for short-term land tenure situation where you might be renting land with no assurance that you're going to get that rented land in future years, or where the pea costs are high relative to crop prices. And I think this is the situation this year. This might not be the year where you taking a look at long-term sustainability, maybe more looking at the short-term sufficiency approach. The long-term sustainability strategy builds pea fertility on low P soils, depletes it on high P fertility soils, aiming for maybe around 15 part per million Olsen P value, but you're considering the long-term fertility of that soil so you don't run it down into the ground. And it's really suited to long-term land tenure and when P costs are relatively low compared to crop prices. And so what we'll see, for example, in the soil fertility guide is really a focus on the short-term P sufficiency strategy. Here we've got a scenario with crops with a 10 part per million Olsen P level in their field. And if you're fertilizing a cereal crop, you get a recommendation for 30 in the seed row, canola, 20 pounds phosphate in the seed row. That's not enough to counterbalance the amount of phosphate that's removed at harvest. This type of recommendation is actually going to drive your pea fertility down with time over the long term. Some additional factors for phosphorus fertilization. The response varies from not only one crop species to the other, but even within a crop, from one hybrid or variety to another. We've got data now to show that corn hybrids vary dramatically in the response to phosphorus, for example. But even among the crops, the P response in cereals and canola is much better or larger than for flax or soybeans. So crop would be another factor in your consideration for prioritizing fields for phosphorus fertility. Bottom line, fertilizer cost is high and soil test P is medium. Maybe ban some modest rates of starter P, similar to what's in maybe the soil fertility guide, enter near the seed row and focus on your cereals and canola. And you might, in a year like this, skip the P applications for soybeans and flax, realizing that this type of strategy only works in the short term because you're drawing down your overall P fertility. In terms of source placement timing, good old-fashioned monoammonium phosphate 1152.0 is the preferred source for prairie soils, better than some of the other granular sources that are available. The liquid polyphosphate fertilizer performs equally well, no better, no worse overall. And the other enhanced products that Cindy Grant, for example, is experimented with haven't shown any benefit over these conventional fertilizers. Microbials and mycorrhizal inoculants have not yet shown consistent benefits. And one of the challenges here is that when you introduce a biological product, it has to compete with the local organisms in the soil. And so it doesn't always work out the way the advertising says. So we just focus on the basics and recommend banding soil test P in or near the seed row, especially if your soil test P is low or you have cold soil or dry soil compaction. And if you're seeding, of course, early, you've got some of these challenges to deal with. The crop can benefit from that starter P. Here's some data to sort of back that up. This is a long-term set of trials with Western Co-op fertilizers. And if they looked over their whole data set, when they looked at banding 20 kilos per hectare, which is 18 pounds an acre, it was as good as broadcasting 72 pounds an acre. So it took 4 times as much phosphate fertilizer broadcast to match the yield response to the seed place banded P. Pretty strong evidence for banding P. Now, you also want to make sure that you're not banding too much P in the seed row, especially if you have narrow openers on your air drill or seeder and you have wide row spacings. Here's a demonstration at Portage La Prairie, 20 pounds of phosphate per acre with disc openers at 12-inch spacing and even 20 pounds of phosphate in the seed row under those conditions with a very dry spring was enough to hurt the canola stand. So what about sulfur, potassium micronutrients? These are just as essential as nitrogen and phosphorus, but the responses to fertilizer are much less frequent. If you've got a soil that's deficient in these nutrients, it's really important to deal with those deficiencies. We would recommend that you follow the Manitoba Soil Fertility Guide recommendations and not get too aggressive putting on nutrients that you may not get a response to. And for S, this might mean that you put on an insurance application for soils for crops like canola, where that modest investment in that nutrient is likely to pay off just because of the variability of S in the field. But for most other crops, we've not seen many responses to sulfur. For potassium, there's soil test thresholds of anywhere between 100 and 200 part per million for various crops. And once again, we recommend caution applying potassium to high K soils in a year like this when fertilizer is very expensive. And lastly, there's a table in the Soil Fertility Guide about micronutrients. Some of our soils are deficient in micronutrients, but that's a very small proportion of our land base. And just a reminder, banding has been shown to be better for nitrogen. John showed that. I showed that it's better for phosphorus as well. It's better for potassium fertilizer. Here's a trial that was conducted near Elm Creek, Manitoba, a number of years ago, and 27 pounds per acre seed row placed was as good as 107 pounds of potassium fertilizer that was broadcast. So once again, 4 times more efficiency from banding the K compared to broadcasting the K. So even though some of these broadcast applications are regarded as a convenient way and a quick way to get fertilizer on, the efficiency translating it into crop yield is relatively poor. I'd like to follow that to talk about fertilizer with a little bit of conversation about livestock manures. Worldwide, farmers are taking a closer look at manure as maybe a substitute for fertilizer. Here's an article from an Irish farm magazine. Fertilizer, as it turns out, Ireland is awash with the stuff. Lots of people trying to figure out how to maybe use their manure better so that they don't have to purchase as much fertilizer. So I will talk a little bit about manure management in this 4R sort of conceptual framework. In terms of the right rate, one of the things we want to do with the manure is aim for nutrient balance over the long term and avoid consecutive annual applications. Short-term applications of manure to meet the crop's N-based rate does a great job of supplying nutrients, but it may, in most cases, apply more P and K, for example, than what the crop is going to use in that particular year. In terms of sources and placement for liquid manures, the majority in Manitoba, vast majority, are injected or incorporated, same with the solid manures. So we're in pretty good shape that way here in Manitoba. In terms of timing, we have regulations that prevent application on frozen or snow-covered soils, but these are well documented as being poor management practices for nutrient use efficiency. So it's a good thing we've got those regulations here. It helps make good agronomic sense as well as environmental sense. In order to evaluate some of these concepts, we conducted some long-term experiments at the Glenlee Research Station a number of years ago, and from 2007 to 2015, over that 8-year period, for example, we had applications of no fertilizer, conventional synthetic fertilizer, liquid pig manure, solid pig manure, and solid dairy manure in various crops over that 8-year period. We had 2 manure application rates in this long-term experiment, yearly applications to meet the crop's N requirements, and then intermittent applications to meet the N requirements and then fill in the years in between with fertilizer applications. I'm just going to talk about the yearly applied manure treatments just to give an idea of how manure can improve soil fertility. The nitrogen that's in manure comes in 2 forms: ammonium nitrogen, which is immediately available to crops, similar to anhydrous ammonia or urea fertilizer, really. And the available ammonium N is estimated in manure by calculating how much could be lost under different weather conditions and application methods. And then there's the organic N component, which needs to be decomposed biologically before it can become available to crops. And the available organic N guidelines that we use here in Manitoba estimate that conversion at about 25% per year. So 25% of the total organic N available in the first year application. And these are the sort of assumptions we used when setting up our long-term manure management trial at Glenlee. Now, in reality, some of these standard calculations, especially for the organic N, ignore the effect of weather and carbon to nitrogen ratios on the rate of decomposition. If we take a look at solid beef cattle manure, it's got a pretty high carbon to nitrogen ratio compared to something like poultry manure. And that high carbon to nitrogen ratio means that the microbes need to do a lot of work before you finally get that nitrogen in a plant available form. So if we look at our long-term trials with these different manures and we rate them relative to synthetic fertilizer, we found that over that 8-year period, the liquid pig manure worked quite well and was able to match the yield increase that we got from the synthetic fertilizers. But the solid manures, they were really slow in releasing their nitrogen, and it took quite a while, several years, before they finally got their yields up to where the synthetic fertilizer was in terms of yield response. And a friend of mine from the United States was at the site one time, and he says, yeah, it takes a long time for those solid manures to get revved up and release that nitrogen, and that's exactly how this worked out. Now, if we look at the nitrogen that we recovered from those manure treatments compared to what we expected from the standard formula, once again, we found that there was a lag period, especially for the solid fertilizers. At the beginning of that trial, the solid fertilizers were very slow in releasing their nitrogen. Once they got going, the yield responses were pretty decent. And so if we take a look at the cumulative nitrogen recovery and we look at what we picked up in the soil and the plants compared to what we expected, in the continuous synthetic fertilizer, we're about 60% recovery, which is actually better than the overall average we would expect might be 50% recovery in the crop. The yearly pig manure was 50%, very similar, statistically no different from the synthetic fertilizer, but the solid manures were poor at releasing nitrogen. We were only getting anywhere between 6 and 11% of the total N that was applied in that manure was recovered in the crop. So they're not coming close to that 25% per year estimate in our standard formulas, and we've had to change our recommendations accordingly. Now, with respect to the other nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, the ratio of P to N in the livestock manures is relatively high compared to crop removal. And so what we find is that if you apply manure to meet the crop's N requirements, you're applying several years worth of phosphorus to that cropland. And potassium is in the same boat. The potassium content is often substantially greater than the P content, and the chemical availability of the K is pretty high. And so the P and the K nutrient value is relatively high and shows up pretty quickly in a soil test. So the application of the manure to meet the crop's N requirements can really boost your P and K fertility. And for anybody that's got concerns about low K and P fertility in their soil, manure can be a fantastic resource. And here's an example over the long-term trials. The Olson soil test P levels rose dramatically what we're seeing here is that solid pig manure applied to meet the crop's end requirements increased the soil test P levels right up to the Manitoba's maximum regulatory threshold of 180 part per million. And in fact, we had to get special permission to continue this trial because we were breaking through all these regulatory limits and contravening provincial regulations. But anyways, the solid dairy manure also increased the P fertility dramatically, and you can see liquid pig manure as well. All those soil test P values above 60 part per million, which is much higher than the average level we'd see in Manitoba, 15 part per million. So dramatic increases in P fertility with manure, and that can be a great way to restore soils that have depleted P fertility. Here's a chart that shows the soil test K response, big responses to K here as well, especially with the solid manures, the solid pig manure, solid dairy manure in particular, showing up with relatively high K values. They started off this soil at 700 part per million soil test K, and now it's up with these manure treatments to 1100 to 1300 ppm, and the liquid pig manure raising it as well, but the control and synthetic fertilizer, sort of a slow depletion there because we weren't adding K fertilizer. So if you've got some challenges with P and K fertility and you have access to manure, that can be a fantastic way of improving your K and your P fertility in your land. The second sort of phase of our trials, we wanted to see what was the residual availability of the nutrients after fertilizing them with synthetic fertilizer or livestock manure for 8 years. We ran the trials for a couple of years without any additional nutrient being added. And the long-term control, this is land that's gone into the 9th and 10th years of no fertilizer or manure application, yielding like 14, 15 bushels the acre of wheat and canola. The synthetic fertilized treatment that continued on was 57 to 60 bushels per acre. And then these other shaded boxes here just represent the treatments which, even without any added manure or fertilizer, it's been discontinued, were able to produce excellent yields, statistically similar to the continuously fertilized trials. And so that stored nutrient from the leftover nutrients from the manure were able to sustain relatively high yields of wheat and canola in those subsequent years. And in fact, in the discontinued dairy manure treatments, 60 bushels of wheat and canola with 0 fertilizer manure added in those 2 years. And this is because of the mineralization of that stored organic nitrogen that wasn't available in the first 8 years of the trial. It's being decomposed, the organic matter is being decomposed, and the nitrogen's being released. So lots of factors to consider for the nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, micronutrient sort of perspectives, and especially in a year like this when fertilizer is so expensive and crop prices are good. How do we monitor and evaluate what we're doing? Well, soil testing. And there's 3 perspectives I'd like to encourage you to consider. One is using soil tests to predict the next year's crop requirements, but also using it as a tool to evaluate your historical management practices for the past year. This is a very good tool to evaluate whether your soil might have a history that gives it a lot of capacity to release nitrogen during the growing season. If you've got more leftover nitrogen in some fields than others, it might be because you've got more capacity to mineralize organic matter. Then also you can use soil testing to monitor trends over the long term, and monitoring for trends in soil test P or K or salinity, very, very useful purpose as well. So just to summarize, the overall situation of high prices and for fertilizers and for crops has increased the financial risks from over or under fertilizing. And it means that we want to apply our nutrients extraordinarily efficiently. High prices have also increased the rewards for that careful application. and employing the principles of 4R nutrient stewardship are more important than ever. There's nothing brand new about these concepts. They're just a lot more important than they have been in the past. So for this coming year, we recommend using soil tests to help select crops for fields. Take advantage of that reserve of leftover nitrogen, for example, to plant crops that other farmers might be reluctant to plant, for example. Depending on soil N and moisture reserves, ban modest rates of N away from the seed, put some starter P for your cereals and canola, and follow the provincial recommendations for KS and micronutrients. And if moisture conditions and markets, including the protein premiums, which could be pretty substantial in a year like this one, and the weather forecast is favorable, you could add supplemental N in the growing season, but make sure that you've got a decent probability of rainfall to move that nitrogen into the soil, as John mentioned with his results from the Indian Head Agricultural Research Foundation.